This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zachariason.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zachariason, and this is episode 828 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. Last week's Sleeper Show had some good parts and some bad parts. Derek Carr was a respectable streamer, and I called out Trey McBride, Jake Ferguson, and Taysom Hill, who were all really strong plays. And I briefly talked about Rashid Shaheed, too. But a lot of the wide receivers and running backs were just pretty average at best overall. Whether we're talking about Devin Singletary, Amari DeMarcado, or Jawan Jennings, who gave us a goose egg. There was some good from week 8, but I definitely want to be better than that. Hopefully things do look better here in week 9. I can't talk about Derek Carr this week because he's now officially over the 50% rostered mark over on Yahoo. So he doesn't fit in this bucket of players who are rostered in 10 to 50% of leagues who you might be able to play. I do have a few quarterback streamers for you though. One of them is Gardner Minshew. Minshew gets the Panthers. Carolina's actually been a below average opponent for quarterbacks this season. They rank as the 23rd best opponent in adjusted fantasy points allowed to the position. So it's not like some ideal matchup. A lot of that has to do with the fact that teams are running the ball so much against the Panthers. Carolina has actually allowed the most offensive touchdowns in football, but fewer than 42% of those touchdowns have come through the air. That's the third lowest rate in the league. They're last in rushing yards over expected allowed per rush, and they're middle of the road in passing EPA per dropback allowed. So I do think there's some risk that Indianapolis just runs all day against Carolina. I also think there's a possibility that when Indy scores, variance takes over a little bit. Those touchdowns come from Minshew's arm. That's always a possibility in a one-game sample. I think there's risk involved with any of these streamers. Indianapolis, though, has the 7th best implied team total on this week's slate, according to FanDuel Sportsbook. Minshew's not a terrible bet. In that same game, too, is Bryce Young. I like Minshew more than Young, but I do think that Young works. The Colts' defense is not very good. They've given up the 3rd most offensive touchdowns this year, and like Carolina, a lot of those touchdowns have come via the ground. I think both teams are ready to regress in that category. But Indy ranks as the 2nd best matchup for quarterbacks in adjusted fantasy points allowed, and Bryce Young is starting to look the part a little bit more. After scoring 9.4 points per game over his first 3, he's averaged 15.2 over his last 3. And Colts games, for the record, these Indianapolis games this year, they've been shooting out. According to my buddy Rich Rebar from Sharp Football Analysis at Lord Reeves on Twitter, Colts games are averaging a league high 136.6 combined snaps per game. They're averaging a combined 54.3 points per game. That's the 2nd highest in the league behind only Miami. Basically, don't sleep on the quarterbacks in this matchup. And you could also look at Baker Mayfield if you want. I'm not super high on him, but he does work. Mayfield gets Houston, and the Bucs have just an 18.5 point implied team total. That's not great. Houston, though, is the 12th best matchup by adjusted fantasy points allowed. And they've been below average against the pass, according to EPA per dropback. So I think Mayfield's fine enough among a pretty bad quarterback landscape. Now moving on to running back, everyone's understandably excited about Gus Edwards after the last couple of weeks and how he's performed. But Justice Hill just last week played 26 offensive snaps. Gus Edwards was at 34. Baltimore's just playing in these super positive game scripts, and that's always going to favor a guy like Gus Edwards. But Justice Hill had a 15.4% target share last week. Over the last 2 games, his route participation has been around 56%, Gus Edwards 30%. Now they get Seattle in week 9. Not only is there a chance that we see a closer game here for Baltimore, and that might favor Hill a little bit more than what we've seen over the last 2 weeks, but Seattle ranks 5th in adjusted target share allowed to running backs, meaning teams are throwing the ball to their running backs at a higher rate when they face Seattle. So off the waiver wire, there are definitely worse choices. And then one more running back from you in this tier. It's a repeat of last week. It's Devin Singletary. Week 8 featured a Houston offense that really just couldn't get anything going. But Singletary's peripherals weren't bad. He saw a 40% running back rush share. That was his 2nd highest of the season. And his 8.3% target share tied a season high. They're still splitting this backfield. There's still a committee. And I think that's the expectation moving forward. But Singletary is looked at as a far inferior fantasy asset compared to Dameon Pierce. I don't agree with that. Singletary is getting more passing game work. Pierce is the goal line guy. That's what it looks like right now. I'd almost rather take on Singletary's role as a fantasy manager than Dameon Pierce's, if this continues. Now, it's not a great matchup, but very few waiver wire running backs are seeing volume right now. And for the record, Dameon Pierce missed practice on Wednesday, so keep an eye on that. But let's roll with Singletary here once again. Now, shifting our focus to wide receiver, you could go back to Rashid Shaheed, but know that he's a volatile big play receiver. Shaheed hasn't even hit a 20% target share in a single game this season, and despite his huge performance last week, his snap share only 27%. His usage in that offense actually dropped this past week from what we were used to seeing throughout the season. Now, hopefully that turns around given his performance. And he gets the Bears this week, a team that's ranked as a top half opponent this year in completion rate allowed on 15-plus air yard throws. So maybe Shaheed has some more big plays in him. Elijah Moore is now under the 50% rostered mark, and it's understandable as to why. He hasn't been producing. He scored double-digit PPR points just once this season, and that's despite the fact that his route participation is well into the 80s and lower 90s. Now, I'm intrigued by him this week because he's played over half of his snaps this year from the slot, and Cleveland gets Arizona. The Cardinals rank 5th this season in target share allowed to the slot, and they're 3rd in slot yards allowed. So Moore might have a spiked week, for him at least. Now, Tank Dell was a bust last week, and he's now gone 3 straight games without a double-digit PPR game. That could change here in Week 9. The Texans get a Bucs team that's allowed the 10th most adjusted fantasy points to wide receivers, and last week, Dell saw a 17% target share and had the best route participation of his season. You gotta hope the Texans can just move the ball a little bit better than they did last week. If they do, Dell's going to be fine. Brandon Cooks has scored in back-to-back games, and while I'm definitely not projecting that to happen in Week 9, he's had okay enough usage over this 2-game stretch. The Cowboys get the Eagles this week, and Philadelphia's secondary has allowed the 2nd most adjusted points to wide receivers this year. Dallas also has a bottom 10 pass rate on the season, but the Eagles have faced the highest pass rate and the 2nd highest neutral script pass rate. Now, that's partially due to game script, but they've also been great against the run and just average to above average against the pass. That's when looking at EPA per dropback allowed. So the Cowboys should throw the ball a little bit more in this matchup, and that's going to benefit someone like Brandon Cooks. And then the last wide receiver in this tier, Jayden Reed. Reed ran the most routes for Green Bay in Week 8. He ended up with a season and career high 83 receiving yards. That was on a route participation of 89%, by far a season high. If that continues, given his talent profile, he could be a decent enough flex. Just kidding, there's one more wide receiver, Demario Douglas. Kendrick Bourne is out for the season because he tore his ACL, and like I said in the 10 Trends episode, Douglas ended last week with his best usage of the season. He had a 25% target share, and he ran a route on 84% of his team's dropbacks. This week, he gets Washington. They just lost some defensive pieces, and they were already the best matchup for wide receivers in adjusted fantasy points allowed. So Demario Douglas makes a ton of sense. Now at tight end, I'll keep this one short. Trey McBride. He saw the highest target share that any tight end has seen in a single game this year back in Week 8. And that target share came 1 game after Zach Ertz was put on IR. Now I will say, the Browns who he's facing this week, it's the toughest matchup on paper for a tight end. But that volume's going to go a very long way. And then I know you're probably sick of me recommending the mediocre Luke Musgrave. And look, I'm not expecting the world, but his spot against the Rams is great. Only Cincinnati has been a better matchup for tight ends this year, and the Packers are using Musgrave as their primary pass catcher at tight end. He saw a dip in target share this past week. It was 7.5%, but he was still running routes at a similar rate as his previous 2 games. And in those games, he saw target shares of 24% and 15%. In this matchup, he's totally fine as a streamer. This next tier of players consists of guys who are rostered in fewer than 10% of Yahoo leagues. And I gotta be honest, it's rough out there this week for this tier. That's what happens when there's so many buys. At quarterback, Zach Wilson and PJ Walker, they have the matchups, but they've been brutal as fantasy assets this year. Taylor Heineke might be intriguing, but Minnesota's defense's opponent this week, they've been a lot better of late. And good luck finding sub 10% roster running backs who are going to see more than like 5 touches. They just don't exist. Maybe Pierre Strong? He's a possibility, but it sounds like Jerome Ford is feeling better about his ankle. All of this is to say that I'm not going to force things here. You can go with some of the guys that I just mentioned, but I'm not mentioning them with that much conviction. Let's instead just shift our focus to wide receiver. Jonathan Mingo is rostered in about 7% of Yahoo leagues, and honestly, that number should probably be higher. His snap shares over his last 3 games have been 86%, 93%, and 98.5%. His route participation has been right in line with those snap rates. He's coming off a game where he had a 16% target share, catching 4 or 5 targets for 62 yards. And now he gets a Colts team that's not only been involved in shootouts this year, like I talked about earlier, but they've been a top 10 opponent for wide receivers in adjusted fantasy points allowed. So I think Mingo is very interesting. And if you're in a moderately deep league, you might want to roster him. Now, the other sub 10% wide receiver that I want to talk about today is a guy that I mentioned in the 15 transactions episode. It's Khalil Shakir. Shakir watched his target share rise from 10% in week 7 to 15% in week 8, and his snap share shot up to 65%. This is all coming with the team not having Dawson Knox. So they're likely to use a little bit more 11 personnel, more 3 wide sets. Now, Shakir has played 75% of his snaps this year from the slot, and I would assume that continues. Buffalo gets Cincinnati, and the Bengals have been a below average opponent for slot guys this year. But the usage in the offense that he's involved with could still make Shakir viable, even if I do think that it's a Dalton Kincaid week. And speaking of tight ends, speaking of Dalton Kincaid, I can't recommend him on this podcast because he's rostered in far too many leagues now. A player I can recommend is Cade Otton. He's had back-to-back games with 6 targets, and he has elite route participation. According to FantasyLife.com, on the season, Otton is 5th in tight end route participation. He's competing with legit players like Mike Evans and Chris Godwin, yes. But get this, Houston ranks 1st in adjusted tight end target share allowed. Teams are targeting their tight ends against Houston at a much higher rate than their average. And then on top of that, they're the 8th best matchup for tight ends in adjusted fantasy points allowed. So it could be an okay week for Cade Otton. Now, as for the defensive streamers, I talked about Atlanta on the 15 transactions episode, and they work against the Vikings and Jaren Hall. There's also the Chargers against the Jets. They're a top 10 opponent for defenses in adjusted fantasy points allowed. And there's New England against Washington. Washington has been an awesome opponent for defenses, ranking 2nd in adjusted fantasy points allowed. And then you could realistically use both the Giants and the Raiders in that same game. That game profiles to be a low-scoring game with a 37.5 point over-under according to FanDuel Sportsbook. And both the Giants and the Raiders, they're top 6 opponents for defenses in adjusted fantasy points allowed. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. Greatly appreciated as always. I'll talk to you tomorrow.